The chandelier above sparkled like a constellation trapped in crystal, casting fractured light over the grand ballroom. The air smelled of aged wine and wealth, silent, untouchable. Julian Lockwood, the billionaire heir to Lockwood Industries, stood at the heart of it all. His navy tuxedo fit him like a second skin, his platinum watch glinting under the chandeliers. Every movement he made was deliberate, calculated, like a man who had never known anything but power. "Julian," a woman in a sequined dress purred, handing him a glass of champagne. "Your charity gala is absolutely exquisite." He took the glass, offering her a practiced smile. "Of course it is," he said smoothly. "Only the finest for those who can appreciate it." Laughter rippled around him. He loved these moments. The effortless control, the unspoken hierarchy that placed him at the top. Then, the moment shattered. From the grand entrance, a frail figure stood, hesitant, out of place. An older woman, wrapped in a tattered shawl, her silver-streaked hair tied in a simple knot. Her clothes, modest and worn, were in stark contrast to the extravagant gowns and tailored suits that filled the room. Julian's jaw clenched. Who let this woman in? Whispers slithered through the crowd. The guests parted as the woman stepped forward, eyes darting around as if she didn't belong, which, in Julian's mind, she didn't. "Mr. Lockwood," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every disapproving stare in the room. I need to speak with you." Julian set down his glass. His patience was thin. "Do you?" His tone was ice wrapped in silk. "Or did you mistake this for a shelter?" Laughter followed. "Good. Let her know her place." The woman hesitated, gripping the edges of her shawl as if it could shield her from their judgment. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she continued, voice softer now. "I worked for your father many years ago." The amusement in Julian's expression flickered into something colder. "Another beggar from my father's past." "And?" he prompted, crossing his arms. Evelyn swallowed, her eyes betraying a quiet resilience. "Your father promised me something before he passed, a chance to save my home. I've come to ask you to honor that promise." The crowd leaned in, hungry for the spectacle. Julian gave her an incredulous look, then chuckled, shaking his head. "You must be joking." He stepped closer, towering over her. "Do you really think you can walk in here, into my gala, dressed like that, speaking of some forgotten favor, and expect me to entertain it?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around her shawl. "I would not be here if I had any other choice," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Julian exhaled sharply, then turned toward the crowd with a smirk. "You hear that? She wouldn't be here if she had a choice." He gestured to the glittering walls, the golden chandeliers. "And yet, she still thinks this is where she belongs." More laughter, more whispers. Evelyn's face paled, but she didn't move. "I only ask for what was promised," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its steadiness. Julian's smirk faded. "Enough of this." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crisp $100 bills and held them out. "Here's your charity," he said flatly. "Take it. Leave." The room fell silent. For a moment, Evelyn just stared at the money. Then, slowly, she looked up at Julian, something unreadable in her expression. "I don't want your money," she murmured. Julian's fingers curled around the bills. "Then you want nothing at all?" With a sharp flick of his wrist, he let the money fall, the bills scattering across the marble floor like discarded leaves. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, her shoulders rising in the slightest breath. But she didn't kneel, didn't pick them up. Instead, she turned, the tattered edges of her shawl swaying as she walked toward the door. Julian watched her go, a ghost slipping back into the night. He would never see her again. Or so he thought. The gala resumed as if nothing had happened. Laughter, music, clinking glasses. Evelyn Carter had been nothing more than a fleeting shadow, an unfortunate mistake quickly erased. Julian sipped his champagne, but something about the encounter lingered in his mind, like an off-key note in a symphony. Who was that woman, really? A guest murmured, sidling up beside him. Julian shrugged. A relic from my father's past. Nothing more. Yet when he returned to his penthouse that night, he found himself pacing. His father had been many things, ruthless, calculating, but sentimental. Never. If he had promised something to a woman like Evelyn, there must have been a reason. Still, it wasn't his problem. She had her chance, and she walked away. The city was wrapped in its usual rhythm. Business meetings, stock reports, the endless churn of high society. Julian barely spared another thought for the old woman, until the headlines came. Elderly woman found unconscious on city streets, once employee of Lockwood Industries. His assistant Rachel hesitated before sliding the printed article across his desk. She collapsed last night near Fifth Avenue. Malnutrition, hypothermia. Julian barely looked at it. And? Rachel hesitated. She has no living relatives. The hospital reached out. They were hoping you might... Not my concern, he interrupted, flipping the paper shut. I don't run a charity. Rachel didn't move. She worked for your father for over 30 years, Julian. So did hundreds of others. Rachel inhaled sharply, but she wasn't just an employee. She was his... She stopped herself. Never mind. She turned to leave, but Julian caught the flicker of something in her expression. Guilt? Wait, he said. Finish your sentence. Rachel hesitated, then placed a small, aged envelope on his desk. This was found in her pocket. She left without another word. For a moment, Julian just stared at the envelope. It was old, the edges softened with time. His father's name was written on it, his handwriting. Julian's fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in neat, deliberate strokes. Evelyn, I failed you once. I won't again. The house will be yours. It is my debt to pay. Richard Lockwood. Julian's breath caught. The house. A memory surfaced. His father's study. A whispered conversation he was never supposed to hear. She sacrificed everything for this family, Julian. More than you know. She was a maid, father. She was more than that. He had dismissed it back then, just another one of his father's cryptic musings. But now, Julian's fingers curled around the letter. His father had promised her the house, and Julian had let her walk out of that gala with nothing. His chest tightened. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to shame. Julian sat motionless, the letter heavy in his hands. The words gnawed at him, unraveling the certainty he had always carried, that his father was a ruthless businessman who owed no one anything. But this was a debt unpaid. He pushed back from his desk and grabbed his coat. Rachel, he called, striding toward the elevator. Which hospital? Her brows lifted in surprise. St. Vincent's, but... The elevator doors slid shut before she could finish. Julian found Evelyn in a dimly lit room, wrapped in thin white sheets. The monitors beside her beeped steadily, counting the seconds she had left. Her breathing was shallow, her frail frame barely shifting beneath the blanket. For the first time, she looked small to him, not defiant, not composed, just tired. A nurse passed by and gave him a wary glance. Are you family? Julian hesitated. Then quietly he said, Yes. The nurse nodded and left him alone with the woman he had humiliated days before. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the beeping door. At first, she just stared at him, as if uncertain whether he was real. You, she whispered. Julian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Me. She tried to shift, but even that small movement made her wince. Why are you here? He hesitated before stepping closer, placing the old letter on the tray beside her. My father. He swallowed. He owed you something, and I didn't listen. Evelyn blinked, her gaze flickering toward the letter. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she chuckled, a weak rasping sound. You think guilt fixes everything, don't you? Julian tensed. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. You want me to say it's all right? Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper, that your father's mistakes and your own can be undone with one visit. But that's not how the world works. Julian clenched his jaw. I'm trying. Her eyes softened. Then try harder. Before he could respond, her body trembled. The monitor's beeps quickened. A nurse rushed in, pushing him aside as the room filled with commotion. Ma'am, stay with me, the nurse urged, but Evelyn's eyes found Julian's one last time. And then, silence. Julian stood frozen, the weight of what he had done and what he hadn't crushing him. The nurse lowered her head. I'm sorry, she murmured. Julian swallowed hard. Too late. Or was it? He turned sharply on his heel and stormed out, his mind racing. There had to be something more he could do. The night air was sharp against Julian's skin as he stepped out of the hospital. His driver was already waiting, but he didn't get in. He needed to think. Evelyn's final words clung to him like a curse. Then try harder. The guilt was unbearable. For the first time in his life, he had all the power in the world, and yet, when it truly mattered, he had done nothing. His father had promised her that house, and Julian had taken it away without a second thought. Not anymore. A reporter's voice crackled over the city's morning news broadcast. In an unexpected move, billionaire Julian Lockwood has donated his father's historic estate to a newly founded shelter for displaced women, renaming it Evelyn House in honor of a longtime Lockwood employee who dedicated her life to the family's service. Julian switched off the television. He didn't need to hear the rest. The media would paint it as an act of philanthropy, a strategic PR move. Let them. It wasn't for them. He stood in the grand foyer of the mansion, now emptied of its lavish furniture, its chandeliers dimmed. Soon, the space would be filled with women who had nowhere else to go. Women like Evelyn. He stepped out onto the estate's steps, where a small crowd had gathered. Activists, city officials, former employees. A woman approached him, her eyes welling with gratitude. Mr. Lockwood, she said, this will change lives. Julian gave a short nod, hands in his pockets. He wasn't looking for thanks. His gaze drifted to the sky, where the last light of the setting sun cast long shadows over the mansion. Would Evelyn have approved? Maybe, maybe not. But for the first time in his life, Julian Lockwood had done something that truly mattered. And that, at least, was a start.